My name is Sarah Federman. I am a professor at the University of Baltimore in negotiations and conflict management. And I just wanted to share with you today a presentation that I just gave at Keene University, who hosted a conference called Large-Scale Mass Atrocity. It was co-hosted by the Auschwitz Institute and the Cardozo Law School. So because the issues are so prevalent, the role of corporate actors in mass atrocity, and kind of under-discussed in our field, I wanted to make this available on video as well. So this is about a 25-minute video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to look at my website, languageofconflict.com, and then I'll have my email address kind of throughout this presentation as well. So just a little bit of how I came to this work before I became a professor. I was a global advertising executive traveling all around the world. I did a little business program at Harvard. And so I got to see the world of business, going to the headquarters of Google and Discovery and MTV and Expedia and so on. So that gave me a real taste of culture of corporate life. But when I came to our work in conflict and human rights, I noticed that we talked a lot about rebel groups, victim groups, states, NGOs, but there was very little talk about market actors, businesses, and money, how money was flowing between all of these groups. Because coming from the business world, that's basically all that we were focused on. So I really noticed that absence. And one of the reasons this matters so much right now, as many of you well know, that corporations are growing massively in size relative to countries. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, today, in 2017, 51% of the world's largest entities are actually corporations rather than countries. Only 49% are countries. But let's just do a more specific example. So at this point, Walmart is now larger than 170 countries. And Exxon is larger than 150. So we're seeing a real shift in power. And of course, it's not just bigger than governments. We have a lot of corporate power in governments, and that's been true all over the world for a long time. In the United States, we're seeing this in a new way. For example, we now have Rex Tillerson, who was a large executive at Exxon, and we in the cabinet, and we also have a senior executive from Goldman Sachs. So the separation between government and corporate is a lot smaller than it ever was. And so it's really something to pay attention to in our field of conflict resolution, peace building, development, anywhere you are working in the spectrum, transitional justice, human rights, and so on. And one of the things I'm arguing in my research is that when we're too focused on a state-centric model, we're really finding ourselves on the wrong planet. We think we're here with all of these different flags in these different countries, but the world we're operating in looks much more like this. And you may have heard that corporations have increasingly more rights than they have obligations. Why do they have more rights than obligations? Well, very simply, because they lobby for them. Corporations are not lobbying for obligations. And the people who are lobbying for them are not nearly as strong. So again, we're going to see many more rights that corporations are going to get in the coming years than obligations. And I'm going to talk in this presentation what obligations corporations have in relation to human rights in terms of mass atrocity and how difficult it is to hold them accountable. So this idea of marginalization of corporate issues is starting to become talked about. There's not as much research yet on the role of market actors in mass atrocity, so I encourage you, if you're a researcher, or a student, or faculty, contact me and let me know what research you're doing and maybe brainstorm some ideas of projects you could do in this area. Okay, so in this presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the checks and balances for corporate abuses related to the mass atrocity. What actually does exist in a legal space? So I'm going to look at international and domestic courts, the power of public pressure, UN efforts, and then before doing that, I wanted to go into a little bit of the history of mass atrocity, of corporate accountability. And unsurprisingly, it actually began in Nuremberg. So after the Nuremberg trials that most people know about, there was a second military tribunal that was led by the US military, or this number of corporate actors were held accountable for their corporation's role in the Nazi war effort. So the number of executives were held accountable not for the genocide, not for their role in the Holocaust specifically, but for supporting the Nazi war effort. And a number of them, about 12 of them, went to prison, none of them more than 8 years. And the corporation wasn't held accountable, just a number of senior executives. Those senior executives, after their 8-year prison sentence, went on to run post-war Europe. So, and the corporations went on none of them was disbanded. So that was the beginning of lawyers trying to figure out how to hold corporate actors accountable for their role in war, and they didn't really get too far in relation to the genocide. For example, I.G. Farben, which provided the Zyklone B gas that was used in the gas chambers during the Holocaust, was not held accountable for that, but for the use of slave labor. Even though they had a large factory at Auschwitz, it was very hard to prove that they knew that the gas that they were supplying was being used to murder people, not for sanitation. So they were just able to prove that they had slave labor. So again, at the end of the Second Military Tribunal, no actual corporation was held accountable, no corporation was dissolved, sentences were largely a slap on the wrist. You couldn't prove collective accountability, so you couldn't prove that the whole organization was at fault. And it was very difficult to prove individual knowledge, that they knew how their products were being used. So we'll see some of these same issues are still quite difficult today. Just how I got into this, for my doctoral work, I was working on the role of the French National Railways in the deportation of Jews during World War II. If you've been to France, or if you are from France, you know very well the SNCF, which is the French National Railways. When Germany occupied France, that railway had a role in transporting deportees to the German border. And then they went on to Auschwitz, and most were murdered. It's about 76,000 people. So there's been an ongoing conflict today over whether that company has done enough to make amends. Especially in the United States, there's groups who don't want them doing business in the US until they've paid survivors. So that's been an ongoing conflict that I've studied. So that was the first case I studied. As I said, so that railroad had deported almost 76,000 people. There was a large debate over whether or not the company was paid. And then I looked at, did the company charge? Did they know the destination? Would it have been better to deport everybody for free? What did people know? So these kinds of questions that I was struggling with in relation to the SNCF are still problems in corporate cases today. And I'll show that. And then the question of if they could have improved the conditions. And I did my work through interviews. So a lot of interviews with SNCF and lawyers and survivors and ambassadors and so on. So that's how I came to this work. And it's really interesting conflict because I learned a lot about the role of courts. So in France, for example, the Conseil d'État, which is the highest administrative court in France, actually ruled in 2008 that no more was owed for World War II. So that even though the loss from the Holocaust was actually an irreparable harm was done, that the court would not be willing to keep hearing these cases about the SNCF or any other actor that had a role. So you can see that courts can sometimes close. Then this conflict actually went to the United States, where a class action lawsuit was launched out of New York. But because the railroad was state-owned and operated, they were protected by the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which means that as an American, you can't sue France. And because the railroad was actually a state-owned company, it was hard for Americans or deportees from around the world to use American courts to do that. So that froze. And these same dynamics you're going to see in a lot of other cases today. But it did push France towards a settlement, and some people who hadn't received payments before did receive funding. So you can see how these pressure does matter. But the complicity continues. This is why my work has continued beyond the role of the French National Railway. It's very disheartening to find out that the German chemical industry that actually provided the gases for the concentration camps during the Holocaust also helped Saddam Hussein with his Kurdish genocide. So Michael Kelly recently produced a book called Persecuting Corporations for Genocide, and this is one of the examples that he gave of how this complicity is still going on. It hasn't really stopped. If you're familiar with the Chiquita case, I should also add Del Monte and Dole, but Chiquita is the one that has really been focused on. Chiquita was paying has paid more than $2 million to paramilitary groups in order to allow them to continue with their operations. So there's been a lot of research on that. That company actually paid about $25 million to the US Justice Department as a result of that. Then Firestone. I don't know if any of you have Firestone tires or have been to Liberia, but so Firestone has been one of Liberia's biggest employers. And actually, before Charles Taylor took over the country, was one of the country's biggest source of revenues. It still might be today. But when first Doe disemboweled the president, and then Charles Taylor took over, he and his group actually saddled themselves. They put up a base on the rubber plantation that Firestone had, and then operated out of there. And Firestone was paying Charles Taylor's group before Charles Taylor was president, which was basically funding their decimation of villages and his hostile takeover, his coup. So there was a lot of questions about accountability for Firestone and what happened in Liberia. Some people also might be familiar with the Nestle conflict. So not just Nestle, but Mars and Hershey. There was shown that there was human trafficking, largely child human trafficking between the Ivory Coast and Mali, and all these cocoa providers and like the different kinds of chocolates they were using. A lot of them were buying chocolate from basically children's slaves, cocoa that had been collected by child slaves. Nestle has done much better in different kind of human rights benchmarks in recent years. It is difficult to shake your past when you're a corporation once you've been targeted as having been involved in these, but these are just important cases, especially for teachers. If you teach history, you teach economics, you teach human rights, it can be really fun in the classroom and fascinating to have students actually research these brands and other popular brands to find out what histories they have. Any kind of large international company, any company over 50 years old, you're probably going to find some compromises in there that they made. And they're great discussion, great debates, because a lot of students, even if they're interested in human rights, may go on to work for corporations. So it's really important to have people thinking through these issues. What do you do if you're at Firestone and Charles Taylor's military group comes and lands on your lawn? How do you handle that? Do you pull out of the country or do you keep going? Because a number of the employees at Firestone, and this is a complication, wanted the company to stay. They felt abandoned when the company at certain times would leave during the violence because it was their source of income. And they perceived it as a source of safety, although the company was unable or unwilling to protect them. Okay, well, those are just a few examples. Again, this was the book I was referring to before, Prosecuting Corporations for Genocide. I just wrote a book review on this book, and it was great. But Michael Kelly talks really well about some of the legal challenges, and I just wanted to share that if there's any lawyers or people interested in doing human rights law who wanted to know some of the issues that are being faced. First of all, it's very simply, there are just no courts to try corporations right now. We have the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Court was started. The Rome Statute said it was for natural persons, which means people with a body, actual criminals, individuals, not entities. Now, there was some discussion that actually they were going to add legal persons, but it was just too busy during, and they had time pressure, and they weren't able to do it. But now that corporations have grown so large, it's time to revisit it, and that was one of the suggestions of the book. Then we have the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is UN's legislative arm, and it tries states, so states holding each other accountable. And that's great because it handles collectives, but it doesn't yet handle collectives like companies. So collectives, I mean more than one person. You have the criminal court, which does individuals, and you have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, but that does entities, but not yet companies. So you see there's no actual court for these guys. Then we have domestic courts. Now, most people want human rights abuses to be dealt with in the country in which the abuses have occurred. There's a number of issues with domestic courts, even though we have high hopes for them. First of all, most of these crimes are happening abroad. So you'll have like a large US company, but it'll have a subsidiary somewhere that's part of this, like Firestone, Exxon, Shell. This is how a lot of this happens. But then there's an issue is that a lot of these domestic courts either are unable to hold them accountable or not willing to hold these corporations accountable. And this is one of the recurring questions that comes up. So we have an example of Chevron. There was an oil spill in Ecuador, and I know it's not genocide in that sense, but the courts tried to hold Chevron accountable, and they were unable to get the company to pay the money after the court ruled. The fine, I think, was about $12 million. So I could say unwilling. It's possible that they were unable. They could have just there could have been payoffs, and there could have been reasons why they let the company go. But that money actually never, even though they tried this case in a domestic court, Chevron never paid. And then there's a lot of cases where there are a lot of payoffs. There's a lot of arms dealing and corruption in a number of these states where these abuses occur. So people that are running the state aren't actually protecting the victims either. So one of the domestic courts that people hope is going to be a great source for human rights violations has been the US courts because, one, there's class action, and we have something called the Alien Tort Statute, which was so a number of human rights lawyers try to use this to hold subsidiaries accountable. And the most famous case where this did not work was the Kiobel case about Shell's operations in Nigeria, the extradition and torture of a number of workers in Nigeria. And the idea was that the court ruled that, okay, while the Alien Tort Statute can be used to hold corporations accountable, so that's great news, we have a problem of extraterritoriality. This happened in Nigeria, so the US actually can't hold this subsidiary accountable abroad for these Nigerian workers. So they can effectively walk away. Okay, so let's just say we had a court that was designed just to hold market actors accountable for their role in massive human rights violations. And just to define kind of what that means, and I'm using that term rather broadly in this conversation. It can mean genocide. It can mean the destruction of a village. It can mean murdering, torturing, in some way kind of removing protesting workers, and so on. So, but we can kind of, that definition can broaden and shrink depending on the conversation that you're in. Okay, but let's just say we had a court. Now, some of the difficulties that we've had is that proving, I meant proving mens rea, which is proving that the corporation had a guilty mind. So when you're proving a criminal act, you need to prove actus reus, so there was a guilty act that occurred, which is generally easier to prove, than having a guilty mind, and that's what you're trying to do in criminal law. So in incorporation, if you're trying to use that model of guilty act and guilty mind, you have to prove that that these corporations knowingly participated in genocide or in the atrocity, which they can claim they did not know, that they were just payoffs. For example, Chiquita could just say, we were just paying off these groups so that we could operate. We didn't know what they were using the money for. Or Firestone could say the same thing, right? So they could say we didn't know. And then the I.G. Farben case and the German chemical companies that provided the gases, the chemical compounds that were needed to gas the Kurds under Saddam Hussein. So there can be a lot of like, well, we didn't know. That happened with the French Railroad. We didn't know where the trains were going. How could we have known? So you have difficulty proving who knew what and that they knew that it was going to be used for genocide. You also have the difficulty of proving where in the corporation the mind is located. So for example, is it located in the executives? Or what about the guy who took the order for the chemicals, who very clearly knew how they were going to be used? There would be no surprise. What about the shareholders? Is it the customers, other customers of that company? Like, where does it actually lie? And what you're finding is it's a very complicated, corporations are very complicated webs of communication. And maybe back during World War II, when the SNCF was part of the Holocaust, there was very controlled lines of communication. But today, those are much more blurred with email and so on. So it's really difficult to figure out who knew what, how much they knew, and how much accountability they should hold. Then there is so that's the idea of like there's no soul to damn, no body to kick. There's nowhere to actually grab. There's no criminal to hold on to. And this is the problem with collective accountability more generally. And a number of scholars, and even former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said, it's just when you start going after collectives, one of the problems is that their concern is that you're going to create this blame cycle and this just cycle of revenge that's going to keep the whole society locked in focusing on the past. So what ends up happening, and what Madeleine Albright believes is important, is to hold the main people, like Milosevic, who were accountable for their role or prompting the genocide, hold them accountable and then expunge the collective. The idea being that you need to let people move forward. So in most cases, people are getting away with murder, the actual people who are doing it, and just so that we don't live in this cycle of blame. But the problem with corporations is that you're just kind of leaving them intact, and most people get away with it. And those who are at the top still have their golden parachutes, so they kind of hop off to another company, and they tend not to be held accountable. Or they hop off to the cabinet. So. The other reason, the other challenge we would have is that even if we had a court to hold corporations accountable, corporations have far more money to throw at their defense. Legal fees, lobbying teams, and it's really hard to match that. Even with a very passionate human rights team, the amount of energy behind, because these companies want to thrive. There's a big energy on growing, because they know if they don't grow, they're going to die. So. There's a lot of force that you're going to have to contend with, and they're giving huge corporate contributions to elections and different officials, so you have that challenge as well. Okay, so then even if we had a court, and we would be able to get back beyond all those legal arguments, if we had a conviction, where would the money go? This is another challenge. So one of the heartbreaking aspects of the Chiquita case, for me anyway, is that when Chiquita paid the $25 million, it paid the money to the US Justice Department. They were unable to get the money to the actual victims. I'm not sure why supporting a paramilitary group in Colombia requires the Justice Department to get paid, but that's how that played out. There have been some other cases where some victims for some of the other atrocities have been able to come forward and fight with a lot of support and get direct settlements from companies. So that is possible, but that requires a lot of advocacy, mobilization, and sustained pressure on these companies. Okay, then let's just say we have a conviction. So let's say we have a court, we get by all the arguments, we hold the corporation accountable, and then we get this $25 million for the village that was decimated, let's say, or the employees who suffered. What can courts offer long term? Deterrence. Does it really work? Is Chiquita having to pay that money, does that really deter Dole and Del Monte or other companies from actually participating the same way? Because the lead executives are able to leave. They tend not to pay the money themselves. And this is kind of the question of like, some people say the free market will correct for all this. For example, that if Dole sees that Chiquita has to pay $25 million, they won't do the same thing. Well, that might be true if executives stayed in their positions for long periods of time and really were in the company for the long haul. But right now in this economy, we're seeing people change jobs very quickly. People aren't staying with the same company for year after year after year. So they're focused on short-term gains. And it might make sense financially, short-term, to pay off the company, grow your bananas, and sell them. So I'm not sure a deterrence is actually going to work. Another concern that I've had recently, and this came after doing my work on a number of companies that were complicit in the Holocaust, in the Nazi war machine, is that the ethos of the company remains unchanged. So companies are not just some executive makes a decision and that's why they got involved. There's an ethos, there's a sense of values, there's a way of communicating. If you've worked for a number of different, even more than one organization, you know how different they can be, how different the values are. A lot of it's determined by the leadership, but some of these companies are quite old and they have a corporate culture that precedes even the executives that are in power. So if that ethos remains intact, you might see a lot of the similar behavior. I mean, when I was working on my research on World War II, a number of the companies I was studying were all actually being indicted in 2014. Every day I saw a different company on the cover of New York Times. That's actually the Wall Street Journal, being indicted for something else. So I had Siemens, we had JP Morgan, we had Barclays. So a lot of these companies here they were again. And of course Volkswagen, but in a different context this time. So possible additions to what to courts. So I was thinking, so what might be an actual solution? What might actually deter companies? This doesn't speak to how we can serve the victims, but what might actually deter it? And I thought, well, rather than just maybe putting an executive away for a number of years or having them pay a huge fine, what if we actually had the death penalty for corporations? What if actually your company could be disbanded? There was a question about this with, I think, a company called SAC. It was a hedge fund company that was almost disbanded by the courts because it was just seen as filled with bad apples, because a number of the people who were hired were only hired because they had made questionable trades in the past. So that was an idea that the corporation itself was actually rotten. People often remember Arthur Andersen, Andersen Consulting, and Enron, when that all happened. They weren't actually disbanded. A lot of them had just fallen apart before that had actually happened. But so this is one possibility, if we had a court to actually offer the death penalty. And then at least, if we're not going to have the death penalty, that you would have to extradition of your subsidiaries. So what does that mean? So if you're Firestone and you're operating in your rubber plantation and a rebel group has a coup and overthrows the company and starts trying to force you to pay to fund their military efforts, that you actually pull out of that country, that the courts would actually force them to pull out until they could be there in a sustainable way that wasn't causing massive human rights violations. And this is actually what Chiquita did. For a time, they at least pulled out of Colombia. Okay, so beyond courts. So this was just something because, remember at the beginning, I said that I have a website called languageofconflict.com. I'm very fascinated with how we articulate our conflicts and what that creates in terms of possible solutions and what solutions that closes out. So in this case, how does language of conflict apply to this issue? So one of the things we talk about in our field is resource curse. I think it's a little bit blared out with the lighting. But so this idea of a resource curse means, while you may be great to think, it might be great that your country has diamonds and oil and precious minerals and so on, actually what ends up happening is that it makes weak countries more vulnerable. So think, for example, Sudan, which has lots of oil, and the Chinese oil industry has really set up shop there and is taking a lot of oil out of both North and South Sudan. So the idea that it's a curse, because all it means is it attracts a lot of attention, the money doesn't actually get to the people, and there's a lot of exploitation that happens. So the reason I just take issue with resource curse as a framing, not that the ideology isn't correct, but what you end up saying is there's actually no accountability in that. It's just the resource that cursed the country. No, it's not the diamonds that cursed the country, and it's not the oil that actually cursed it. It's how those minerals and resources are being extracted and used, and how the people are being treated, and how the money is flowing. So if you can just understand what I'm saying by that, it just means that when you say resource curse, it's like saying the war on drugs. Like, heroin isn't killing people. People using heroin and selling heroin, there are people involved in this. So that level of abstraction, I think, is dangerous. So I wanted to really zoom in on where the problem actually is. So there are some arguments, I know it sounds crazy, but there are actually some arguments against holding corporations accountable. And I just want to acknowledge those because they might be on people's mind. One is that these corporations are too big to fail, especially in these weaker countries. So in the Firestone example, a number of the employees were very upset about the possibility that the company would leave. This was their source of income, right? And it also, when they had a stable government, they were paying a lot of taxes that the government was relying upon. So you pull these companies out, the countries can really implode too. It's not necessarily great for that. So one, the corporation can pull out, and you can lose jobs. You also lose a lot of foreign investment, because when they see a big company move out, other investors won't invest in that region either. So there's a question of pulling out is really better. And then, of course, innocent people lose their jobs. I mean, most of these people, at least in the Firestone case, had nothing, in Chiquita, they had nothing to do with this. They had nothing to do with these paramilitary groups, but they're the ones who take the hit. And then the idea that shareholders are also hurt. Okay, so that's about corporate liability in terms of holding them accountable in courts. But what about corporate social responsibility? And this is a whole area, which is, so the difference between responsibility and accountability is basically being caught for something you already did, whereas social responsibility is stepping forward and saying you're going to help out in a proactive way. So corporate social responsibility related to mass atrocity and genocide. So some of you have seen, in response to President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Accord, a number of companies, including Microsoft, Goldman Sachs, Google, Facebook, and even GE have all stepped up and said that they're actually going to be leaders now in climate change and reducing emissions and polluting the planet and so on. So one of the things we are seeing is that not only are corporations larger than countries in many cases, they're actually stepping up to maybe be the voice, we'll see, of environmental protection and human rights. So this is a huge possibility, a huge area to leverage. So this is all these people need to be connected with, and hopefully they're working together and working with people in our field, really partnering to figure out how we can do that, because it might be hard, especially to rely on these weaker countries. Okay, so if those of you who work with the UN or are interested in working with the UN, there has been some work around corporate social responsibility. Again, these proactive movements. Professor John Ruggie, who's at Harvard, he wrote the Global Compact, which invites companies to voluntarily say, I'm going to uphold human rights. We're not going to be part of these atrocities. So he had about 3,000 companies join. And there's issues with reporting and so on, but that was kind of a public way of saying we want corporate companies to be part of the solution. Then there was a national action plan where the State Department was spending a lot of time in the past few years trying to figure out how to network with corporations and intersect with with government, to see how we could work together to protect human rights around the world. Then from the private sector, you have the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. The Corporate Human Rights Benchmark is something that was created. You can look at it online. It's a great report. You can see apparel, extraction, and some other food industries, and see how they scale on different human rights factors. So this was something that was produced by people who want to invest. So you can see, do I want to invest in this company or that company, and how are they doing? So this is something that comes from the private sector that encourages human rights, corporate social responsibility as well. And this is important because, let me just go back a slide. So not all, for example, not all extraction companies are, you can't really see that because of the light, but BHP, Billiton, they actually are an extraction company, but they ranked very high in human rights. So it's not that all extraction is terrible and all organic companies are good, right? It's much more textured than that. And so we're starting to get to look at that. So this was just their report for apparel, athletic apparel in 2017. And you can see up on the top, we have, this is food and apparel, actually all of them. Nestle, who was a big perpetrator earlier, has gone back to the top of the list. Adidas, Unilever have ranked very high. Then lower down, we have Nike. And turned out Under Armour, I was so disappointed because that brand has done so well, and it's based in Baltimore where I teach. But they ranked very low this year on human rights. So it's really great to just take a look at that, even as a consumer, if not a shareholder. Okay, so in addition to corporate social responsibility, when companies aren't stepping up, we have, or just a nod right now to like these very courageous investigative journalists. Frontline did a fantastic show on Firestone. 60 Minutes is great, and there's a lot of journalists out there who are doing the really risky work. I mean, to go get film footage of these child slaves is very dangerous, and to go in and start to look at corruption is very dangerous. So we know that. I think. That's why there's so many journalists that get sent to prison. But a lot of this investigative reporting is very powerful. If it can get on big shows like 60 Minutes and Frontline, it can move the needle. So that's a very important tool as well. And social media. I worked in advertising before this, as I had mentioned. So I know a little bit about how advertisers are actually watching their social media feed. So if you write a comment and say @Shell, they have a feed that's letting them know. They're able to see the different kinds of comments they're getting. So that pressure actually does add up. Lobbying is important. I did a little lobbying on Capitol Hill for some various genocide prevention bills and so on. So it's just great to see how the government works and get in there. And then there's some increasing literature in our field that's a little more academic. There's a new Business Conflict and Human Rights Network. I just wrote an article for the Genocide Prevention Journal on the role of market actors. So there's some more coming. And again, when I talk about corporate accountability for mass atrocity, I'm not only saying how to hold accountable and punish corporations. We really have the potential to partner with them, and that's actually where the future is going to be, because that's where the power is. And so you can do that in your classes, you can do it in your research. And overall, I just want people to remember that which world we're in, and as much as I love history and I love the nation-state model, I don't want to deny the fact that very large corporations are really setting the agenda in a lot of places and providing us with a lot of great gadgets and improving our way of life in many, many ways. So it's not all bad or good, but I just want to make sure that the field of human rights and conflict resolution and development doesn't get sidelined by just over-focusing on NGOs and governments and all of that work. So thank you for paying attention this long. You can reach me again, languageofconflict.com. I'll put my email down here. And I would love to hear any work that you're doing in this area or any case studies that you found. Thank you.